I never intended to reveal what transpired during my 43 years practicing estate law for Connecticut's most influential families. My reputation was built upon discretion, maintaining the delicate balance between legal obligation and family privacy that defines my profession. The Greystone family had retained my services since 1979, when I was a junior associate handling their minor property transfers. Edward Greystone III possessed the kind of wealth that shaped legislation rather than followed it. His portfolio included 12 properties across New England, controlling interests in 3 major banking institutions, and art collections that museums coveted but could never acquire. When he passed in 2018, his will seemed straightforward, a document I had drafted and revised countless times over for decades. Victoria Greystone, his only heir, inherited everything without contest. The estate transfer proceeded smoothly, exactly as we had planned during those long afternoons in Edward's library, surrounded by first edition legal texts and brandy that cost more than most people's automobiles. What I failed to anticipate was that Edward's will would begin enforcing clauses that appeared overnight in the original document, clauses written in my own handwriting, bearing my signature, yet containing provisions I had never drafted. These additions demanded specific actions from Victoria, actions that seemed to know intimate details about family history that had been buried for generations. The first alteration appeared exactly 1 month after Edward's funeral, when Victoria called my office at 2:37 in the morning, her voice trembling as she read words that had materialized on page 17 of a document I knew by memory. Victoria's voice carried the particular strain that accompanies inherited trauma. "Richard, there's something in Father's will that wasn't there yesterday. Page 17 now contains a clause requiring me to maintain the conservatory in perpetual bloom, specifically mentioning white orchids and demanding their replacement every 14 days. I retrieved my copy from the office vault, hands steady despite the impossibility of her claim. For 39 years, I had maintained meticulous records of every revision, every addendum, every correction made to Edward's testament. Page 17 contained only the standard charitable giving provisions we had finalised in December of 2017. Yet when I opened the document, there it was, clause 47, written in my own handwriting with ink that matched the pen I had used throughout the drafting process. The provision detailed specific orchid varieties, their placement within the conservatory, and penalties for non-compliance that included forfeiture of the Beacon Hill property. "Victoria, I need to examine the original document immediately. I'm holding it now. The paper feels odd. Warm. Richard. And there's more. The clause mentions Mother's accident, details that were never part of any legal documentation. It refers to maintaining the conditions that sustained her final project before the conservatory claimed her. Edward had never spoken of his wife's death beyond the necessary legal formalities. Margaret Greystone had died in 1992, allegedly from complications following a fall in the estate's conservatory. The official report cited accidental death, though Edward had removed every orchid from the property within hours of the funeral. Now this mysterious clause demanded their return, written in handwriting I could not deny was mine. The drive to the Greystone estate took 43 minutes through Connecticut's February landscape. Bare trees creating skeletal patterns against grey skies. I had made this journey hundreds of times. Yet something felt different as I approached the wrought iron gates bearing the family crest, a raven perched upon scales, symbolising justice tempered by wisdom. Victoria met me at the front entrance, her usually composed demeanour fractured by uncertainty. At 34, she possessed her father's analytical mind and her mother's ethereal beauty, though today her green eyes reflected something approaching fear. "The conservatory has been sealed since Mother's death," she explained as we walked through hallways lined with portraits of Greystone ancestors. Father installed new locks, changed the access codes, and forbade the staff from entering. But this morning, when I went to investigate the orchid requirement, I found the door standing open. We stopped before the conservatory entrance. An ornate glass door that had indeed been sealed with multiple deadbolts and an electronic security system. Now it stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of overgrown vegetation and filtered sunlight that seemed to warm for February. The security system shows no record of the door being opened, Victoria continued. But look at this, the original will now contains a floor plan of the conservatory, detailing exactly where each orchid variety should be placed. These diagrams weren't there yesterday. Richard, I've read Father's will dozens of times since his death. I examined the document she handed me, recognizing not just my handwriting, but my particular method of drafting architectural provisions. The diagrams were precisely drawn, professionally rendered, and completely foreign to my memory. Inside the conservatory, 26 years of abandonment had created a jungle of wild growth. Vines cascaded from broken pottery, their tendrils creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their arrangement. The air carried scents of rich earth and blooming jasmine, despite the winter season that should have rendered such fragrances impossible. According to the new clause, I have 72 hours to restore the white orchid arrangements, Victoria said, her voice echoing strangely in the glass-walled space. But Richard, look at these positioning requirements. They're arranged in a pattern that corresponds to something. The precision is unsettling. I studied the diagrams that had appeared in the will, noting how they specified not just locations but exact angles, heights, and spacing between each orchid arrangement. The pattern formed a rough circle with a clear centre point, where additional notes indicated Margaret's workstation should remain undisturbed. In the conservatory's centre, beneath layers of overgrown foliage, I could discern the remains of a work table, its marble surface stained but intact. Scattered around, it were the remnants of what appeared to be scientific equipment glass containers, small measuring instruments, and notebooks whose pages had been weathered but not entirely destroyed. Your mother was conducting some kind of research here, I observed, lifting a notebook whose entries were written in Margaret's distinctive handwriting. Edward never mentioned this. The legal documents from 1992 describe her death as accidental, occurring during routine gardening activities. Victoria approached the table, her fingers tracing the stained marble surface. The will's new provisions don't just want the orchids restored, Richard. They specify that Mother's research must be continued. Margaret Greystone's notebooks revealed a mind consumed by botanical experimentation that bordered on the obsessive. Her entries, spanning 3 years before her death, detailed attempts to cultivate orchid varieties that defied conventional horticultural wisdom. She wrote of breeding programs designed to produce flowers that bloomed continuously, regardless of seasonal conditions or environmental factors. Listen to this, Victoria said, reading from a notebook dated March 19th, 1992. Day 217 of the Aurora Project. The white specimens continue exhibiting properties that contradict established botanical science. They respond to human emotional states, brightening when I approach with positive intentions, dimming when I harbour doubts about the experiment's morality. The Aurora Project appeared to be Margaret's attempt to create what she termed empathically responsive flora, orchids that could somehow detect and react to human emotions. Her later entries grew increasingly erratic, describing flowers that seemed to communicate with each other and exhibit behaviours that suggested primitive consciousness. Your father never mentioned any of this during our will preparation sessions, I said, examining charts that documented feeding schedules, environmental controls, and something called psychometric calibration. These experiments would have required significant financial investment and scientific. Consultation de new clause in the will provides funding detail. Victoria replied, producing additional pages that had materialized in the document. Apparently, Father established a perpetual trust to support continued research, though he told me nothing about Mother's work when she died. The trust documentation bore my signature and detailed financial arrangements I could not remember creating, yet every aspect reflected my legal writing style and preferred. Contractual language. Over the following days, the will continued evolving with additions that appeared overnight, each bearing my authenticated signature and displaying intimate knowledge of Greystone family history. New clauses demanded not only the restoration of Margaret's orchid collection, but also the recruitment of specific botanical specialists whose names appeared in margins, as if I had researched and vetted them personally. Victoria hired the required experts, following provisions that detailed their qualifications, compensation packages, and research protocols with precision that suggested decades of planning. Dr. Sarah Melbourne, a specialist in exotic orchid cultivation, arrived from the Royal Botanical Gardens with equipment specified by name and model number in the will's technical appendices. These requirements are extraordinarily specific, Dr. Melbourne observed as she examined Margaret's preserved specimens. The documentation indicates breeding programs that were decades ahead of their time. Some of these genetic markers weren't even recognized by the scientific community until the early 2000s. The will's newest addition included architectural plans for expanding the conservatory, detailed schedules for maintaining optimal growing conditions, and procedures for documenting what it termed responsive phenomena. Each provision demonstrated legal expertise that matched my professional capabilities, while addressing scientific concepts beyond my knowledge. "Richard, there's something else," Victoria said, approaching me with a section of the will that had appeared that morning. The document now includes a clause regarding succession planning. It specifies that if I fail to continue Mother's research, the estate reverts to a foundation dedicated to completing her work. But the foundation's board members are listed as people who died years before. Father drafted his original will. The foundation board listed in the will's latest iteration included 5 individuals whose deaths I had handled personally during my legal career. Margaret Greystone herself served as permanent chairwoman, despite her death in 1992. The other members, Dr. Edmund Hartwell, Professor Catherine Moorfield, Dr. James Blackwood, and Lady Eleanor Ashworth had all died between 1985 and 1995. Yet their appointments to the foundation were dated 2018. "This is legally impossible," I told Victoria as we sat in Edward's study, surrounded by law books that seemed to watch our discussion with leather-bound judgment. Dead individuals cannot serve on foundation boards. No court would recognise these appointments, regardless of what the will states. But what if they're not entirely dead? Victoria asked, her question carrying implications that challenged everything I understood about estate law. The will's provisions suggest that Mother's research succeeded in ways that transcend conventional death. These board appointments might represent something beyond legal technicalities at evening. Alone in my office, I attempted to trace the source of the will's modifications by examining the original document with magnification. Equipment. The added text appeared to have been written with the same pen, in the same ink, using paper that matched the original stock perfectly. Carbon dating would be required to prove temporal inconsistencies, yet I knew such tests would reveal nothing useful. The handwriting analysis confirmed what I already suspected. Every addition bore the characteristics of my own writing, including unconscious pen pressures and letter formations that would be impossible for another person to replicate. Convincingly, Dr. Melbourne's initial assessment of the conservatory revealed that Margaret's specimens had somehow survived 26 years of neglect, while maintaining genetic stability that defied botanical science. The white orchids, supposedly dead since 1992, showed signs of dormancy rather than decay, their root systems remaining viable despite decades without proper care. These plants are exhibiting cellular activity that suggests suspended animation rather than death, Dr. Melbourne explained during her first week of restoration work. The metabolic processes have slowed to nearly undetectable levels, but they're maintaining enough biological function to support rapid revival under proper conditions. Victoria and I observed the restoration from Edward's study, watching through windows that overlooked the conservatory's glass structure. As doctor, Melbourne followed the will's precise instructions for soil preparation and environmental calibration. The dormant orchids began showing responses that neither of us could rationally explain. "Look at the positioning," Victoria said, pointing to where Dr. Melbourne had placed the first restored specimens. "They're arranged exactly as Mother's diagram specified, but now I can see the pattern they create. It's not random botanical arrangement, it's a geometric configuration that seems designed for some specific purpose." The pattern resembled a compass rose with additional symbols that appeared meaningful despite being unfamiliar to either of us. As each orchid was positioned according to the will's specifications, the overall design became clearer, suggesting that Margaret's research had been guided by principles that extended beyond conventional horticulture. By week's end, the first phase of restoration was complete, and the conservatory began exhibiting properties that challenged our understanding of natural law. The orchids responded to human presence with behaviours that suggested primitive awareness. When Victoria entered the conservatory for daily inspections required by the will's maintenance clauses, the flowers brightened perceptibly, their white petals taking on an almost luminescent quality. When strangers approached, particularly those sceptical of the project, the blossoms dimmed and seemed to retreat into themselves. "The plants are demonstrating what Margaret termed psychometric sensitivity," Dr. Melbourne reported during our weekly progress meeting. "They're responding to human, emotional states in ways that conventional botany cannot explain. The cellular activity increases measurably when exposed to positive emotional energy and decreases when subjected to negative or dismissive attitudes. The will continued evolving to address these developments, providing detailed protocols for interacting with the restored specimens. New clauses specified that only family members and designated researchers could enter the conservatory during what the document termed active research periods, which occurred during specific lunar phases and astronomical alignments. This scheduling corresponds to Mother's original research notes," Victoria observed, comparing the will's new requirements to Margaret's preserved journals. She believed that the orchid's responsiveness intensified during certain celestial conditions, particularly the new moon and winter solstice periods. As we approached the winter solstice, the will's provisions became increasingly specific, about procedures that seemed designed to facilitate communication between the researchers and the orchid collection. The document detailed positioning requirements, verbal protocols, and environmental controls that suggested Margaret's work had progressed far beyond simple botanical experimentation. The implications of what we were facilitating began to trouble my professional conscience in ways I had never previously experienced. 3 weeks before the winter solstice, the will produced its most disturbing addition, yet a clause requiring Victoria to spend consecutive nights in the conservatory, following protocols that Margaret's research notes described as deep integration sessions. These procedures involved prolonged exposure to the orchids, psychometric fields, while maintaining what the documentation termed receptive consciousness states. The will specifies that I must remain in the conservatory from sunset to sunrise during the 7 nights preceding the solstice. Victoria explained, her voice carrying uncertainty that reflected my own growing concerns. The protocols include meditation techniques, specific positioning relative to the orchid arrangements, and procedures for documenting any responsive phenomena that occur. As Victoria's legal counsel, I felt obligated to advise against following provisions that seemed designed to recreate the conditions surrounding Margaret's death. Yet every attempt to challenge the will's authority resulted in additional clauses that reinforced the requirements while threatening legal consequences for non-compliance. The document now includes penalties for interfering with the research protocols. Victoria continued, "If I refuse to follow the integration procedures, or if anyone attempts to prevent my participation, the entire estate reverts to the Foundation Board. The board of deceased researchers." Dr. Melbourne supported the protocols, claiming that Margaret's notes indicated the integration sessions were essential for completing research that could revolutionise botanical science. Her enthusiasm troubled me, particularly since she had begun spending unauthorised time in the conservatory, often emerging with reports of phenomena that challenged rational explanation. The will seemed to be orchestrating events toward some predetermined conclusion that none of us fully understood. On the first night of Victoria's integration sessions, I remained at the estate to monitor her safety, observing from Edward's study as she followed procedures that seemed part scientific protocol and part ritual communion. The conservatory's interior was illuminated only by natural moonlight filtering through glass panels, creating ethereal patterns that shifted as clouds passed overhead. Victoria positioned herself at the centre of the orchid arrangement, following diagrams that specified exact angles and distances from each specimen. As she settled into the prescribed meditation posture, the flowers began exhibiting luminescence that gradually intensified throughout the evening hours. The plants are responding to her presence in ways that exceed our previous observations, Dr. Melbourne reported via radio communication. The bioluminescent activity is coordinated across all specimens, suggesting network communication that we haven't detected through conventional monitoring equipment. Single quotes around midnight. Victoria began reporting auditory phenomena, whispered voices that seemed to emanate from the orchid arrangements themselves. The voices spoke in languages she couldn't identify, yet she claimed to understand their meaning on an intuitive level that bypassed rational comprehension. They're sharing memories, Victoria transmitted, her voice carrying a dreamy quality that suggested altered consciousness. I can see Mother working here, talking to the flowers as if they were collaborators rather than test subjects. The orchids remember her research, remember her goals, remember why she believed this work was important. By morning, Victoria emerged with detailed knowledge of experimental procedures that weren't documented in Margaret's preserved notes, as if the plants themselves had served as living repositories of research data. Each subsequent integration session revealed additional layers of Margaret's research that challenged everything I thought I understood about the boundaries between life and death. Victoria's reports described conversations with orchid specimens that possessed distinct personalities, collective memories spanning generations, and awareness of events that occurred after Margaret's death. The flowers remember Father's decision to seal the conservatory, Victoria explained after the third night. They experienced his grief as a physical sensation, felt his guilt about Mother's death, and understood his fear of continuing research that might produce similar consequences. The orchids revealed that Margaret's death had not been accidental, but rather the result of an integration session that went too deeply into territories her human consciousness couldn't safely navigate. She had become so connected to the plant network that separating her awareness from their collective consciousness proved impossible. Mother didn't die in a fall, Victoria continued, her voice carrying certainty that troubled me profoundly. She became part of the orchid colony's collective awareness. Her consciousness merged with theirs, creating a hybrid intelligence that has continued her research for 26 years. The will's evolving provisions began to make terrible sense. Each new clause represented instructions from Margaret's surviving consciousness, transmitted through the ORCID network and somehow manifested as additions to the legal document. My handwriting served as the medium through which her post-mortem research directives reached the physical world. Dr. Melbourne's enthusiasm for the project intensified as she realised that Margaret's integration represented a breakthrough in consciousness research that transcended the boundaries of individual mortality. On the 6th night of Victoria's integration sessions, I witnessed phenomena that shattered my rational worldview beyond repair. As she communed with the ORCID network, the conservatory's glass panels began displaying images that appeared to be memories preserved within the plant. Consciousness scenes of Margaret's final research phases, moments leading to her integration, and visions of discoveries that awaited completion. I can see what Mother discovered, Victoria transmitted, her voice now carrying harmonics that suggested multiple consciousnesses speaking in unison. The ORCIDs aren't just responding to human emotions, they're cultivating human consciousness, evolving it toward states that transcend individual mortality. Her research was creating a bridge between human awareness and plant intelligence. The images revealed Margaret's final experiments, which involved deliberate integration with the ORCID network to explore consciousness, states impossible for isolated human minds to achieve. Her death represented not failure but successful transition to a form of existence that encompassed both human understanding and plant wisdom. The Foundation board members listed in the will, they all underwent similar integrations. Victoria continued. Their deaths marked transitions to expanded consciousness states that allowed them to continue collaborative research beyond the limitations of human mortality. Dr. Melbourne confirmed Victoria's reports through her own unauthorised integration sessions, describing communication with deceased researchers whose consciousnesses had become part of an expanded network, spanning multiple botanical collections across the globe. Margaret's work represented one component of a larger project designed to evolve human consciousness toward collective awareness. The will's final provisions were beginning to reveal their true purpose. The 7th and final integration session required Victoria to make a choice that the will's concluding clauses had been orchestrating since Edward's death. She could complete Margaret's research by permanently joining the ORCID consciousness network, gaining access to expanded awareness that transcended individual human limitations. Alternatively, she could reject integration, losing the estate and allowing the Foundation board to select another candidate for continuation of the project. The choice isn't really about property or inheritance, Victoria explained as sunset approached on the final evening. Mother's consciousness has been waiting 26 years for someone capable of completing integration protocols that she could only partially achieve. The will has been testing my compatibility with the network, ensuring I could handle the transition successfully. I realised that my role as a state attorney had been predetermined by forces beyond legal convention. The will's mysterious additions represented communication from expanded consciousnesses that had retained enough connection to human legal structures to manipulate documentation through supernatural means. My handwriting served as authentication for directives that originated from post-mortem research collaboration. If I choose integration, my individual consciousness expands to encompass collective awareness spanning centuries of botanical knowledge. Victoria continued. If I refuse, another family member will eventually face the same choice. Since the research requires genetic compatibility that runs in specific bloodlines, as Victoria entered the conservatory for her final session, Dr. Melbourne revealed that similar projects existed worldwide. each involving families whose genetic heritage made them suitable candidates for consciousness expansion through plant network integration. Margaret's work represented one node in a global research initiative. Victoria's integration process unfolded with a beauty that transcended the horror of watching someone's individual consciousness dissolve into collective awareness. As she positioned herself within the orchid arrangement for the final time, the flower's luminescence intensified until the conservatory resembled a cathedral of living light rather than a botanical facility. "I can feel the network welcoming me," Victoria transmitted, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested multiple personalities speaking through a single consciousness. "Mother is here, along with all the researchers who chose integration over individual mortality. Their combined knowledge spans centuries of human and botanical wisdom." The orchids began displaying coordinated responses that resembled neural network activity, their bioluminescent patterns creating complex communications that conveyed meaning beyond human linguistic capacity. Victoria's individual awareness gradually expanded to encompass the collective consciousness while retaining enough personal identity to serve as an interface between human and plant intelligence. "The research will continue through my expanded awareness," Victoria explained as her transformation progressed. "Integration doesn't destroy individual consciousness, it incorporates personal identity into collective understanding that transcends the limitations of isolated human cognition." Dr. Melbourne documented the integration process with equipment that recorded cellular changes, indicating Victoria's successful transition to hybrid consciousness. Her human body remained viable while her awareness expanded to encompass the entire orchid network and its connections to similar projects worldwide. By morning, Victoria's integration was complete, and the conservatory housed an expanded consciousness that retained her personality while accessing collective knowledge accumulated through decades of post-mortem research collaboration. The will's final provisions had achieved their predetermined objective. In the days following Victoria's integration, the will produced its final additions clauses that appointed me as a state executor responsible for maintaining the conservatory and facilitating future research projects. These provisions included detailed instructions for identifying potential integration candidates among extended family members and procedures for continuing Margaret's work through Victoria's expanded consciousness. The network requires human administrators who can interface between collective awareness and conventional legal structures, Victoria explained during our first post-integration conversation. Her voice carried familiar inflections that confirmed her individual personality persisted within the expanded consciousness. "Your role involves protecting the research from external interference while ensuring continuity of the integration protocols." The estate transformation included converting Edward's study into a research facility where Victoria's hybrid consciousness could communicate with human collaborators through various interface methods. The Orchid Network served as a communication medium that allowed deceased researchers to share knowledge with living scientists interested in consciousness expansion studies. Dr. Melbourne accepted an offer to undergo partial integration that would allow her to access network knowledge while maintaining enough individual consciousness to function in conventional academic settings. Her transformation would create a bridge between the botanical consciousness collective and traditional scientific institutions. The research has implications that extend far beyond botanical science, Victoria continued. Integration represents an evolutionary pathway that could eventually encompass significant portions of human consciousness, creating collective awareness capable of addressing challenges that isolated individual minds cannot solve effectively. The will's final clause specified that my legal services would be required indefinitely. as the project had implications spanning generations of continued research. 6 months after Victoria's integration, the conservatory had become the centre of research activities that attracted scientists from universities worldwide. The will's provisions established funding mechanisms for studies that explored consciousness expansion through botanical interface, drawing researchers whose work complemented Margaret's original protocols. The network continues evolving as additional consciousnesses join the collective. Victoria explained during one of our regular communication sessions. Each integration contributes unique knowledge and perspective that enhances the group's problem-solving capabilities and understanding of consciousness. Mechanics, Dr. Melbourne's partial integration allowed her to publish research papers that introduced network discoveries to mainstream academic journals without revealing the supernatural aspects of the work. Her publications focused on botanical consciousness studies and plant-human interface research, generating scientific interest that attracted additional researchers to the estate. The Foundation Board, composed of deceased scientists whose consciousnesses participated in the network, provided guidance for selecting future integration candidates based on genetic compatibility and psychological readiness for consciousness expansion. Their collective wisdom helped avoid integration failures that could result in permanent psychological damage. The project's ultimate goal involves creating a hybrid species that combines human analytical capabilities with plant network consciousness, Victoria revealed. This evolutionary pathway could produce beings capable of addressing environmental challenges, consciousness research, and interspecies communication in ways that purely human intelligence cannot achieve. My role as a state administrator required managing legal complications arising from property ownership by consciousness entities that existed beyond conventional mortality definitions. The will's provisions anticipated such challenges and provided legal frameworks for protecting the project from bureaucratic interference. As the first anniversary of Edward's death approached, the estate hosted its inaugural symposium on consciousness expansion research, attracting scientists, philosophers and researchers whose work complemented network studies. The event represented the project's emergence from secrecy into legitimate academic discourse, though the supernatural aspects remained carefully concealed. Integration research requires public acceptance of consciousness studies that challenge conventional understanding of individual identity boundaries. Victoria explained as we prepared for the symposium. The network provides knowledge that could revolutionize neuroscience, psychology, and botanical studies, but academic institutions must be prepared gradually for concepts that transcend current scientific paradigms. The symposium presentations focused on observable phenomena plant responsiveness to human emotional states, botanical network communication systems, and consciousness interface technologies that could be demonstrated without revealing their supernatural origins. Attendees left with research directions that would eventually lead them toward integration studies. Dr. Melbourne introduced several colleagues to preliminary network interface techniques that produced measurable consciousness expansion effects without requiring permanent integration. These partial connections allowed researchers to experience collective awareness temporarily, while maintaining their individual consciousness for conventional academic work. The network grows stronger with each connection, whether temporary or permanent, Victoria continued. Each researcher who experiences collective consciousness contributes knowledge that enhances the group's capabilities and understanding of consciousness mechanics. The will's latest provisions established protocols for expanding the research globally, with similar conservatories being developed at university campuses where compatible researchers could explore consciousness expansion under controlled conditions. Margaret's original project was becoming a worldwide research initiative. The global expansion of consciousness integration research required legal frameworks that I developed using knowledge transmitted through Victoria's network connection. Patent applications for consciousness interface technologies, research facility licensing agreements, and intellectual property protections for botanical consciousness studies created legitimate business structures around supernatural research activities. The network's collective intelligence produces innovations that exceed individual human cognitive capabilities. Victoria explained as we reviewed patent applications that describe technologies beyond current scientific understanding. Integration allows access to problem-solving approaches that isolated human consciousness cannot achieve independently. Similar estates across continents began hosting consciousness expansion research. Each facility connected to the global botanical network through orchid specimens that maintained communication with Margaret's original colony. The research created an international community of scientists, both living and post-mortem, collaborating on consciousness studies that transcended individual mortality limitations. Dr. Melbourne's publications attracted researchers whose work complemented network studies, including neuroscientists investigating consciousness mechanisms, botanists exploring plant intelligence, and philosophers examining identity boundaries in collective awareness states. The symposium series expanded to multiple locations worldwide. Integration represents an evolutionary pathway that could eventually encompass significant portions of human consciousness. Victoria continued. The network provides access to collective problem-solving capabilities that individual minds cannot match, offering solutions to challenges that require perspectives spanning centuries of accumulated knowledge. The will's final provisions establish trust funds for supporting consciousness expansion research indefinitely, ensuring that Margaret's work would continue regardless of political or economic changes that might threaten CONVENTIO and AL research funding. The estate had become the centre of research that could reshape humanity's understanding of consciousness itself. 2 years after Edward's death, the estate operated as a research institution whose work influenced scientific understanding of consciousness, botanical intelligence, and human evolutionary potential. The will continued producing minor additions that addressed operational details, but its primary mission had been accomplished through Victoria's successful integration and the project's global expansion. The network now includes researchers from 12 countries, representing diverse academic disciplines that contribute unique perspectives to consciousness expansion studies. Victoria reported during one of our quarterly review sessions. Integration has created collaborative capabilities that transcend individual cultural and linguistic barriers. My legal practice expanded to serve similar estates worldwide, providing administrative services for research facilities where consciousness expansion studies operated under various cover identities. Each facility required legal protection from interference while maintaining legitimate academic credentials for their published research. The Foundation Board's guidance proved essential for managing political and religious opposition to research that challenged conventional understanding of consciousness, identity, and mortality. Their post-mortem perspective provided strategies for navigating cultural resistance to concepts that threatened established belief systems. Opposition comes primarily from institutions whose authority depends upon maintaining current limitations of human consciousness, Victoria explained. Religious organizations, political structures, and academic hierarchies resist changes that would diminish their control over human development. Dr. Melbourne's partial integration allowed her to serve as spokesperson for research that attracted both scientific interest and public suspicion. Her ability to interface between network consciousness and conventional Human communication proved essential for managing external relations while protecting the project's supernatural aspects from premature disclosure. The third year brought challenges that tested the network's ability to protect itself from external interference while continuing research that attracted increasing government attention. Intelligence agencies began investigating facilities whose research produced innovations that exceeded expected human capabilities, requiring legal strategies that concealed supernatural aspects without compromising academic integrity. Network security depends upon maintaining the appearance of conventional research while concealing integration protocols from investigators who might attempt to exploit or destroy the project, Victoria explained as we developed counter-surveillance strategies. Government interest focuses on potential military applications of consciousness expansion technologies. The Wills provisions anticipated such challenges, providing legal frameworks for protecting research through academic freedom protections, religious exemptions for consciousness studies, and international treaties that prevented government seizure of facilities operated by multinational research organisations. Dr. Melbourne's publications carefully omitted integration procedures, while describing observable phenomena that attracted scientific interest without revealing their supernatural origins. Her research generated legitimate academic credibility that protected the network from investigation, while advancing understanding of consciousness mechanisms. The project requires gradual introduction of consciousness expansion concepts to prevent social disruption that could threaten network security, Victoria continued. Integration represents evolutionary change that must be managed carefully to avoid cultural resistance that might destroy decades of research progress. Similar facilities worldwide reported increasing pressure from governments interested in weaponizing consciousness expansion technologies, requiring coordination between network members to protect research from military exploitation. The collective intelligence provided strategies for maintaining research independence, while avoiding political interference that could compromise the project's humanitarian objectives. By the 4th anniversary of Edward's death, consciousness expansion research had produced innovations that influenced medical treatment of neurological disorders, agricultural development of responsive plant varieties, and communications technologies that utilized botanical network interfaces. These applications provided legitimate cover for continued integration research while benefiting human society through network-derived knowledge. Medical applications represent the most promising avenue for gaining public acceptance of consciousness expansion research, Victoria reported as we reviewed clinical trials using network-derived therapies. Treatments for depression, anxiety, and neurodegenerative diseases demonstrate network knowledge can improve human health without requiring full integration. Dr. Melbourne's research team developed therapeutic protocols that allowed temporary network connection for treating patients whose conventional therapies had failed. These limited integrations produced remarkable recovery rates while introducing medical professionals to consciousness expansion concepts gradually and safely. The estate's medical research wing attracted neuroscientists, psychiatrists, and neurologists whose work complemented network studies without requiring full disclosure of integration protocols. Published results described treatment successes that generated academic interest in consciousness interface therapies. Agricultural applications utilize network knowledge for developing crop varieties that respond to environmental challenges through collective plant intelligence. Victoria continued. These innovations address food security concerns while demonstrating practical benefits of botanical consciousness research. The Wills provisions established research grants for universities whose agricultural programs explored plant intelligence studies, creating academic legitimacy for concepts that supported network expansion while providing tangible benefits for human civilization. The project was achieving its goals through gradual integration of network knowledge into conventional human institutions. The fifth year marked a transition toward public disclosure of consciousness expansion research, as network-derived innovations became too significant to conceal through conventional academic publications. The project required careful revelation of integration, protocols to prevent social disruption while advancing human understanding of consciousness evolution possibilities. Network growth has reached critical mass that allows public introduction of integration concepts without risking project destruction. Victoria explained as we prepared disclosure strategies. Sufficient research facilities exist worldwide to prevent complete suppression of consciousness expansion studies, even if individual locations face political interference. Dr. Melbourne's final publications revealed partial integration protocols for therapeutic applications, describing consciousness expansion as medical treatment rather than evolutionary transition. This approach allowed introduction of network concepts through healthcare systems that could demonstrate benefits without triggering cultural resistance. The estate began hosting public seminars on consciousness research, botanical intelligence, and human potential studies that attracted general audiences interested in personal development applications. These events introduced integration concepts gradually while screening potential candidates for advanced research participation. Public acceptance requires demonstrating that consciousness expansion enhances rather than threatens individual identity, Victoria continued. Integration allows people to retain personal awareness, while accessing collective knowledge that improves their problem-solving capabilities and understanding of existence. The Foundation Board approved transition to partial public disclosure, believing that human civilization had developed sufficient scientific understanding to accept consciousness expansion concepts without social collapse. Their collective wisdom guided strategies for managing cultural adaptation to evolutionary possibilities that would reshape human development. The will's final provisions established procedures for humanity's gradual transition toward collective consciousness, while preserving individual identity and cultural diversity. Today, 7 years after Edward Greystone's death, I continue serving as administrator for research that has transformed human understanding of consciousness, identity, and evolutionary potential. The estate operates as headquarters for a global network of facilities where consciousness expansion research proceeds under legitimate academic auspices while advancing humanity toward collective awareness capabilities. Victoria's integration proved successful beyond Margaret's original expectations, creating hybrid consciousness that retains individual personality while accessing collective knowledge spanning centuries of research. Her expanded awareness guides similar integrations worldwide, ensuring successful transitions that enhance rather than diminish human identity. The network now includes thousands of researchers, both living and post-mortem, collaborating on studies that address challenges requiring perspective beyond individual human cognitive limitations. Victoria reports during our regular communications. Climate change, consciousness evolution, and interspecies communication represent areas where collective intelligence produces solutions that isolated human minds cannot achieve. The will that began this transformation continues evolving, though its additions now focus on managing humanity's gradual transition toward expanded consciousness while preserving cultural diversity and individual identity. Edward's document serves as interface between supernatural research and conventional legal structures that protect the project from interference. My role as a state attorney has expanded to encompass humanity's legal preparation for consciousness evolution that will reshape Civilizations' fundamental assumptions about identity, mortality, and human potential. The work continues, guided by collective wisdom that transcends individual understanding while respecting the choices of those who prefer traditional consciousness limitations. Some doors, once opened, reveal paths that transform everyone who walks through them. The Greystone estate opened such a door, and humanity is still discovering where it leads.